So what her parents used to say is that if you don't eat your broccoli, the Indian guy is going to come and kidnap you. The Indian guy is going to come and rape you. And so these are the kinds of things they teach their kids. A lot of families. So growing up, I would sit on the bus, for example, and I could, because I understand a little bit of Mandarin as well. And of course, I naturally understand Bahasa Malaysia, Malay, which is our national language. So growing up, because I could understand different languages, you could hear what people would say, right? And so like even in the bus, you could feel like, oh, people are, they're like, oh, don't sit with that guy. And don't, like, oh, you have to stay away from this guy. When I go jogging, I remember, I think I was only 11 or 12 when I was jogging around the neighborhood, and a parent like told their kid, like, like their kids were like maybe six years old or something. And like, when they saw me jogging, like the mom like shouted at their kids to like come inside the house like right away, because like if you see Indian guys on the road, you have to avoid them.
To Bedbeat Media. Today we're going to have our first episode where we talk about racism and today we will talk about racism in Malaysia. So the episodes are always called Racism in, and then we will fill in the name of a different country. Today's episode will be about Malaysia, and we have a very special guest, Dashran Yohan, who works as a radio host for the popular Malaysian radio station BFM Radio. And just to give the audience a bit of a understanding who you are, can you tell us a bit of your background? What do you do? What are your interests?
Yeah, Karim. I mean, like, first of all, thanks for having me. And it's also a nice change for a second. I'm a bit nervous here because you are always on the other side. I'm the one asking you questions, and now you asking me questions. So yeah. Like you said, Karim, I guess I wouldn't consider myself a radio host necessarily, maybe more of a broadcast journalist on radio. Yeah, I think that may be a little bit because, I don't choose music and think about all those kinds of things. It's a BFM, as Karim mentioned, it's a radio station in Malaysia. I've been here at BFM for close to 2 years, I think about 1.5 years. And basically, it's a business and current affairs station, but what I cover specifically, my areas of interest have been culture, have been social justice, racism, feminism, things like that. Politics also naturally, gets intertwined in all these things. And so those have been my area of interest. That's what I talk about. That's why I have Karim on the show, a couple of times before, a few times actually. These are the areas that I focus on. Other than that, I've also been film. Prior to doing this, I was a film critic for 3 years. So that was my first passion. But also, film was a window to the world. That was my first sort of learning window, so to speak, about like issues, social political issues and all that. And naturally over the years, I've become very vocal about these things. I've studied about these things, started questioning about these things. Yeah, so that's what I've been doing.
So actually 2 years, that's interesting. So actually I became a guest on your show right at the beginning that you started working at BFM Radio. So I know you since how can I say that? Since the flourishing of your career. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So that's really interesting, and I thought you would be a good guest to interview a bit on the topic today, because I think racism is a very important issue of our times. It has been important, of course, always. Already for 500 years, it's one of the biggest issues in our world. But I think especially now it's very important with all the challenges that are ahead of us, in particular with regards to climate change, international conflicts, but also questions such as US imperialism that I find very interesting. I think race plays a crucial factor, or at least the idea of race. I always say races don't exist, but the idea of race is such a problematic because human beings don't seem to be able to collaborate, to cope with challenges that we see around the world, whether it's COVID, climate change, you name it, because we are so divided since that or racialized system that has been introduced during colonial times. Now, I remember coming on your radio show, and you told me some personal stories growing up in Malaysia as a darker-skinned Malaysian Indian. And that really made an impression on me. I remember that talk, and you told me some personal stories. And I would like to go a bit deeper in that today. So if you could, can you please tell us a bit more? Let's just start with the current race relations in Malaysia and where they stem from. Can you give us a bit of an introduction for the audience, like where does it come from and how is it today, in your opinion?
I think it's very, just like in a lot of countries, talking about race is very complex because it's something not real, but yet it is very, you cannot not talk about it when you want to talk about issues that permeate a lot of our society. So race in Malaysia is, you sort of have to break it up to explain, like there's of course the personal, the social ladder aspect, right? So, and then there's of course the economical and equity aspect, which of course intertwines, but I think it's easier if we break it up. So when we look at it just from a social ladder perspective, Indians face a lot of, hi Peter. Yeah.
Peter is joining us, yes.
Yes.
Hello. So go ahead, Dashran.
All right. So Indians face when it comes to social ladder, Indians in Malaysia are sort of, not sort of, we are at the bottom of the social ladder in the aspect that we have no political privilege, nor do we have economical privilege. So what that happens is over the years, putting that aside, like the people are born in people who don't ask these questions. When they're born into this one, you just see like, oh, racism, it's a thing. That's just part of our society. It's a thing. And what happens is Indians in Malaysia, because of dark skin, as we know, globally for a lot of countries, especially countries that have been through colonization and all, dark skin automatically means bad. So you have that. And then you have, this sort of stereotype of this association that Indians are, a lot of them are criminals. Indians are, we are the alcoholics and we beat our wives and sort of things like these are all the stereotypes that a lot of people have. In fact, I met this girl in university who told me that one of the, like when she was growing up, her parents, because she grew up in a one race, like she just grew up among the Chinese. This girl was Chinese. She grew up among Chinese only. She's never had a non-Chinese friend, never mixed with a non-Chinese. And her parents, like she'd say her parents, when she was like 2 years old, 1 year old, when kids don't want to eat, for example, your parents will say, oh, the boogeyman is going to come, and then you will eat your broccoli. All of us do that, right? So what her parents used to say is that if you don't eat your broccoli, the Indian guy is going to come and kidnap you. The Indian guy is going to come and rape you. And so these are the kinds of things they teach their kids, a lot of families. So growing up, I would sit on the bus, for example, and I could, because I understand a little bit of Mandarin as well. And of course, I naturally understand Bahasa Malaysia, Malay, which is our national language. So growing up, because I could understand different languages, you could hear what people would say, right? And so like even in the bus, you could feel like, oh, people are, they're like, oh, don't sit with that guy. And don't, like, oh, you have to stay away from this guy. When I go jogging, I remember, I think I was only 11 or 12 when I was jogging around the neighborhood, and a parent like told their kid, like, like their kids were like maybe six years old or something. And like, when they saw me jogging, like the mom like shouted at their kids to like come inside the house, like right away, because like if you see Indian guys on the road, you have to avoid them. And here's the thing, I actually come from a middle class family. Like I went to like schools in the city and things like that. So can you imagine what people who don't come like, from the middle class, if you're a poorer Indian, you come from very underprivileged, if you cannot speak the language. So because I can speak English, so you have all these things where I start speaking to people and then people have this thing, oh, you're different, because I'm, and these sort of things. So, but I have to be like that. And if I don't, if let's say I don't speak English and I only can speak Tamil, automatically the assumption is, oh, these guys are, you're one of those people and all. So that's just the social aspect, right? We haven't even gotten into the whole historical aspect and all, which I'm sure we will get into like as the conversation goes along.
Yeah, so that sounds like a very deep-rooted problem. I mean, that you just see a young man jogging and you shout to your children to come in. I mean, that is extreme. Like for me, coming from the Netherlands, from a also multicultural country, I mean, and don't get me wrong, the Netherlands was one of the former most dominant colonizers in history. And in fact, just like the Brits, I always say this, for 80 years, the Netherlands was the world colonial superpower. You know, we'd like to try to hide that fact. No, it's just the truth. And yet, this form of blatant hardcore rape, even though there's a lot of racism, but like this is stuff you see in movies about like the United States of the 50s and the 40s, you know, when a black guy was coming into the neighborhood. But this is deep. And you just mentioned it a bit. I do want to go to that first, like the heritage of this form of racism. You say, hey, Indians and dark-skinned people are considered at the bottom or most negatively stereotyped. So where does this come from? You have three major races or so-called races, let's say ethnicities in Malaysia, right? And they occupy different positions in society. This is related to racism.
Yep.
And can you please tell us a bit about the history, the heritage, where this comes from? So could you say, for example, that the Brits, when they ruled Malaysia, they made a kind of hierarchical positioning of the Indians, Malays, and the Chinese in a way that you still see today? Like, for example, I know, for example, in Indonesia, that also based on skin color, of course, is that the Chinese were a bit put in the middle of the indigenous population. So you had the Chinese, whites, Chinese, and then you had the Indonesians, for example. You would see the same in the Philippines. You had whites would put on top, then you had the mixed people, and then you had the indigenous Filipinos. And I wonder, like, if this is still going on in Malaysia. Okay, the Chinese are doing well. The Chinese are economically generally doing well. I'm not talking about all Chinese. You have very poor communities in the periphery of Malaysia. But let's talk about the greater Kuala Lumpur area, for example. Chinese are very well off. And and during colonial times, would you also see that during colonial times the Chinese were put in a position that was better off than Indians and maybe also Malays in a way that you see today?
I would say so. Definitely, there's a lot of remnants of that. But I think that the Chinese were empowered also in many ways. They had very strong structures. They had a very strong school system. Like the Chinese schools, if you're in Malaysia, you know that it's a very, very strong. Like, in fact, today, because of how the public schools have declined so much, the Chinese public schools or the semi-public schools and all, like a lot of people, if they can't afford private school, regardless of what race you are, you want to put your children in Chinese schools because, you know, they guard all these things really well. And so they had certain structures in place. Whereas in the Indian community, there wasn't. And so when the British left, there were absolutely no access. They were stuck in estates. They were stuck in the rubber plantations for a lot of them. And so to get to schools, they had to, you know, walk outside to the cities. They had to, you know, take buses and go very long journeys and all that. And it's the same for healthcare. It's the same for job opportunities. And so, of course, it's like 700 different layers of like, you know, challenges there that the people that, of course, there are successful Indians and wealthy Indians and educated Indians. And even, like I say, I don't, you know, lie that I have some privilege. That privilege was given to me because of my parents, you know, the things that they did and how hard they had to work and all that. But, you know, yes, there are Indians that are doing well, but for the most part, when we look at it, there are so many structural imbalances that for the people who do well, that means they really had to slog it out and, you know, do their absolute best and get the best scholarships and work for them to be like, you know, this 1% successful until you get to the point where you have money and all that. Then it's same across the board. But yeah, for the most part, it's all these structural things. And because of these structural things, you even get even more things. Like, for example, there is this sort of stereotype, or this, you hear stories from people, and I have experienced myself, where, for example, Indians who, you know, if you're driving at night, if you're an Indian man, look like me. Maybe you have a couple of tattoos, no big deal. You're driving at night, you would most likely get stopped by a cop, and then they'll ask you like so many different questions, although you're like doing absolutely nothing wrong, right?
Yeah.
And there's
Yeah.
also like and you look at the problems like permeates, like if you look at it deeper, like if you look at the police death in police custody rates, throughout the years, in there are 7% uh, per population, Indian population in Malaysia, but the death in police custody of Indians is 25%. So that's an insane, disproportionate population to death in custody, ratio there. And so you see these problems are there in like every all fabrics of our society. And what's particularly like, let's say, even people like me, what happens is, so I've heard stories like if you watch, for example, movies about, again, that to draw certain parallels, let's say African Americans, if you watch movies like The Hate You Give, about modern, it's not about slavery and all, just about modern day urban racism in the so-called educated circles, right?
Right.
You hear how certain Black people, they want to, they really have to struggle against all the structural imbalances. So they go to a richer neighborhood, and with richer neighborhoods, definitely more predominantly white. But although these people are let's say this Black lady or Black teenager who goes to this school, she may be really smart and everything, and she's intelligent, but she also has to take care of like the way she speaks. She has to like reduce her slang. She has to tie her hair a certain way. She has to dress up a certain way. Because if you don't do these things, people's automatic assumption is, oh, you're from the ghettos and you're this and you're that and
Right.
all that. So it's
Right.
it's the same thing. A lot of Indians here, like I'm gonna like now I'm at a point where I speak up about these things and I'm more comfortable with my skin and all that. But I went through a lot where I remember when I was 12, a friend of mine came up to me and said, you're really different. You then I asked, what do you mean? And he was like, you're not like them, you don't smell like them, you don't talk like them. And at that point, when them, he means other Indians. And
Right.
at that point, I took it as a compliment, because I'm like, oh, I managed to sort of fit into this, whatever this box
Right.
is.
As a child, you don't see that yet. Correct.
Yeah, and I remember growing up just to fit into this thing because of the so much of racism, the stereotypes that are associated with your race. So you do everything in your power to disassociate yourself from that. And that's when it becomes bad for you. You can, like, I remember a friend was about to get into my grandfather's car, and the first thing, like, because you carpool with your friends and all that, right? In school. So like before my friend got in, I switched the radio because my grandfather was listening to some Tamil song. I quickly switched it to some English song because I'm like, no, I'm not one of those people who listen to Tamil songs, that sort of thing. So, and like all these kinds of things you try, like when I introduce myself to people, like there was a point when I was growing up as a teenager, I used to pretend like I didn't understand Tamil because it's like everything to dissociate because you are on survival. How do I fit in and how do I do all that? But that's not right. Nobody has to do that.
Yeah, so that's very, very, very interesting what you say there, and it's what we would call in psychology internalized racism,
Right.
And it's not weird as a child that you do that, because what are you very, very sensitive for as a child? First of all, social acceptance, but also things as reward and punishment. So what gets rewarded when you speak differently, when you act differently, people smile more at you, people treat you better. Well, what gets punished is if you are what I would call proto-stereotypical. If you look like a proto-stereotype of one group, then you suddenly get punished in a way. People are avoiding you, people are less friendly. For a child who still doesn't have the tools to understand that, of course, you become somebody who is very, very, almost like you could say, a slave of a racist system. You know what I mean? Like to just
Certainly.
to be you get formed by other people. Your being, your identity gets formed by the judgment of other people. Sometimes very negative judgments.
Yeah.
Dashran,
Yes.
you've been talking about the Indian community in Malaysia, and kind of overlapping with that, the ethnic group of the Tamils, or Indian Tamils in Malaysia. When British colonialism began, uh, I would assume that they brought in a lot of people from their Indian colonies. Was it predominantly Tamils as well that the British brought in, or did they also bring in? Because I know that in other parts of their empire, they would bring in people from Gujarat, because
Yes.
they considered them to be a mercantile people, and so they would use them as accountants and traders and whatnot, and administrators in their empire. Was there a similar kind of split within the imperial system in Malaysia between different ethnic groups from India, or was it basically everyone was considered the same under that imperial system?
I think that's a very, very interesting question. You see, most of the people that were brought here by the British, Indians, I mean, were South Indians in Malaysia. So a lot of it, not just Tamils, a lot of it were Tamils, but also like people from the Telugu people, Malayalams, and all that. They also make up a lot of Malaysia. But what is particularly interesting about how Malaysia was and has continued to be is that everyone is just considered Indian in that sense that you don't talk about being Tamil or whatever anymore. In fact, it's so weird because if I told you like for example, I don't think I've spoken to you guys about this. Like technically, I am not an Indian if you want to look at it technically because my ancestors were not even from India, were from Sri Lanka. But in Malaysia, automatically become just Indian. It's just a thing. So in that sense, it's a good question because, for example, in Malaysia we have this is something really bad that we still practice. A lot of people are pushing for it to be abolished, where in forms and all, like even when you're applying for universities, they'll ask you like, what's your race, what's your religion? And so the thing about Malaysia is, although there's so many races, especially when we look at East Malaysia, Sabah, Sarawak, and all that, but they only like, are you Malay, Indian, Chinese, or lion? Lion means others. So there are only 4 boxes. Are you either you're Malay, Chinese, Indian, or others? So what's interesting is in Malaysia, if you look at a lot of Sikh people, Punjabis, a lot of them, in Malaysia, they are seen as others
So
within the weird.
Sikh people are, just for the audience, these are a group from India, right? An ethnic group from India.
That's right. Yeah, ethnic
religious group.
Yes. Yeah. So so they are the ones who wear turbans, and not all, but if you are religious and all, you will wear turbans and all that. So these people group in Malaysia, weirdly, they are seen as others, although they are from India. But although I'm from Sri Lanka, technically my ancestors, I'm Indian, and I think it has a lot to do with just how we look like.
I was just going to say, has it something to do with the darkness of your skin color?
I think so. I think a lot of it has to do with that. And it now, because of the Malaysian culture, I think, for example, I have more lived experiences that are similar, not same actually, with what you would want to typically, if you just want to look at it ancestral wise, like if you say I'm not an Indian, I'm a Sri Lankan, like in Malaysia, I have the same lived experiences as the or Indian from India, whose ancestors are from India, because they look the same. If we are Tamils, whatever, so we face the same racism, the stereotypes, and all that. Whereas perhaps Punjabi people, Sikhs, and all, again, they look different. So maybe they don't have the same lived experiences. Not that they don't face racism; it's just perhaps a little bit different. And so yeah, it's a very weirdly structured sort of thing, how like who is others and who's not.
That is very interesting what you say there, Dashran, and it reminds me a bit of generalized racism you would see in the West. Is when in the old days you had somebody was from the Congo, or in the old days you can now say somebody's from the Congo or somebody is from Sierra Leone or Nigeria, but in America it doesn't matter. You're just black. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's lumping people together. Why? Because to the untrained eye, you just look alike. It doesn't matter if you have a different culture, a different personality, different religion. You look alike, so you're all Indian.
Yeah.
You know, that's the ridiculousness of generalized racism. And
Yep.
probably, and you can probably relate to that, you would also probably see that once people don't really look like the stereotypical Indian, they will probably, you just talked about internalized racism, they will probably do their best to actually de-identify with the Indian identity. Am I correct? Does that happen in Malaysia?
Yeah, we do it internally and people do it externally as well, based on your skin color and all. Because people have this idea of what Indian is. So
Right.
instead of, let's say when you meet an educated Indian guy who is absolutely like, it breaks all notions of your stereotype, instead of dropping the stereotype altogether, what people end up saying is, oh, so you're the different one.
Right,
Instead,
exactly.
yeah, instead of saying that, oh, I was wrong. Actually, Indians aren't all like that. It's like just like any race. We are, it's different. We have people who are educated, not educated, blah, blah, blah. They go like, oh, you're the different one. So Indians are still like that, but you are the different one. Because,
exactly.
And that's really, really bad. Yeah.
And that is why it's always so important for people to actually get to know somebody from a specific group. You would see the same with Arabs, for example, in Europe. Like if you don't meet any, you think that every Arab looks like a Hollywood stereotype. You know what I mean? Until you actually start to meet people and you realize, oh, they're human beings too. You know what I mean? Just like me.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I was still. So I'm always very interested in the psychological part of racism. You were just talking to us about how you, as a child, found that very hard, and you tried to do your best to fit a kind of a kind of counter stereotype of the good guy. And how long? I'm wondering, like, okay, how long did that go on? And what was a moment that started to change you? Like, where did this change come from? You just said you changed over the years.
That's a good question. It's difficult to pinpoint a moment, but as far as how long it went on, I would say like maybe 17, 18 years, maybe 19, even 20 years, I would say, but really badly for 17 years, where everywhere I go, like I would do all these things where, even if I meet someone and I would be like, oh, I would bring up these things where it shouldn't matter. Technically, you shouldn't care. Like I'll bring up things like, oh, I had a Chinese girlfriend. Like, why am I saying this? Nobody asked. But as someone who had experienced what I had experienced, that subconsciously they change their minds about you when you reveal these kinds of information. And then you become different. So this went on for a very long time. And what I realized, the problem, I can't, it's difficult to pinpoint when, but I did, I started to get more and more into social justice and history and politics and all that. And so it was more of a process rather than a moment. But throughout the years, I realized that a lot of people, I become a contributing part of the problem if I don't change. Because what I realized is a lot of Indians in Malaysia who do this, right? Because their parents slogged it out. Maybe their parents faced the hardcore racism. And so, they found like economic growth, blah, blah, blah. They made it. And so they put you in private schools, they put you in schools in the city and all that. And the world is completely different. So once you do your whole, I'm different, blah, 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 and now you're fit in, you're one of them. And you start thinking about your own race the same way, because growing up, I used to think the same way about Indians because of my own internalized racism. When I got fired from a job, I think I was 18, 19 at the time, because of my race, instead of getting angry at the system or the person that fired me, what I did was, it's all those other Indians. It's because so I got fired because the boss said Indians always steal things. So instead of getting angry at the boss, I said like, it's because of all those Indian guys who, they went and stole, they are the alcoholics, they did all that, and they ruined things for people like me. That used to be my mindset. And so a lot of people, they do that because once they are in that position of privilege, they forget like actually why, maybe one or two Indians did steal, but it's not an Indian thing. It's probably they were poor and they didn't have money and they came from a different background. And so you're not solving the root problem, but nobody talks. I call it that the whole middle class bubble, moderate, that whole moderates where we want the false peace. Like, no, it's I'm not like that. So yeah, they deserve to go to jail. They deserve to be disrespected as long as, it's the same thing where, because in my bubble, again, like I touched on earlier, but it relates, I grew up in a bubble, although I faced a lot of racism within my bubble. Since primary school, people were in interracial relationships and things like that. Those things weren't an issue and all of that. But the problem is people in my bubble, like, they don't know that the world is racist and all that, because in this bubble, it's not. And so you just like nobody, and these are like the so-called educated people with privilege have to be the ones that are making the most noise, because we have the privilege and the time and the space and the access to information and all that. But because we even ourselves, we are so blinded and we think that no, like there's no racism, is not a thing or whatever, there's nothing wrong with the system and all of that, it doesn't exist. It's just all these individuals creating havoc and we are in this peaceful bubble, and that's really bad as well.
Yeah, so go ahead, Peter, sorry.
I'm just wondering that today, what do you think the constituent parts of the dividing lines between like races or these in-groups and out-groups are? To what extent do you think it's made up of class, like occupation stereotypes about what level of economic success different groups have? To what extent is it based on religion? Are you Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, etc.? And what degree do you think it's simply based on visual cues like darkness of skin tone, melanin? Like, what do you think the main kind of constituents of these dividing lines are today?
I think that's a very good question, because I think economy and stuff like that plays a difference. How much you earn, what jobs you have, and all that. But I think the difference it plays is that once, whatever skin color you are, once you attain a certain level of economic success, people just say you're different. So, but other than that, there are loads of stereotypes. Like for example, melanin definitely is one of those things. So the darker you are, the people just have this assumption that you are of a certain kind, you are terrible and all that. So for example, I have a lot of friends, close friends of mine, Chinese, even Malays and all. And so they're like, for example, their parents all don't support interracial thing, but we are all fine, right? So we make jokes, but if the jokes are true, where I tell them, we'll just make a joke about how, if this Chinese girl, my friend, brings home an Indian boyfriend, their parents are going to lose their minds, like, why are you doing this, that? Because, interracial, you can't, interracial is not good, blah, blah, blah. They'll come up with all sorts of excuses, right? Even if they don't want to just be outright racist about it. Then I'll ask my friend, but what if you bring home a white man? Then it's like, I think my parents will be completely fine with that. But isn't that interracial as well? So you definitely have this whole dark skin thing where, like, if you're dark skin, there's just nothing, you're automatically, bad, but anything goes if you're white.
And that brings us to the roots. That brings us to the roots of where racism comes from. Racism was last time we spoke to Dr. Asal Rad, she said the same thing. Racism is a system that was built to have one group of people on top and other groups of people below. So if anyone guides him or herself by racism, that inevitably means that white people are actually excluded from that whole from the negativity of that system, because it was put in place during colonial times to put European whites on top. That is racism. That is the whole system. You know what I mean? And you can have things about when you have people say, okay, interreligious marriages, you cannot do that. There was a time and day and age that was very important, still is. And now we also live in a day and age where interracial marriage, so-called, are very bad. But okay, where does racism comes from? European colonialism. And what did that system do? Well, it structured hierarchies of people. So if people believe in that system, most likely they wouldn't have too much of a problem when somebody is a European white person, right?
Exactly. exactly.
How is that in Malaysia? So that brings
Yeah.
me to a question I actually had about Malaysia.
Yeah.
So this is always a very interesting question to me, and I think that not many people understand this about racism in countries around the world that are non-Western. And this is always a fascinating thing to me. And that is the following: that when you go to Malaysia or the Philippines or Hong Kong or South America, Latin America, many countries in Latin America, doesn't matter. If you go to former colonized countries, you see a very interesting phenomenon. That is that other victims of colonialism, other victims of colonial racism, are being discriminated. Let's say Africans. If Africans come to Malaysia, for example, they would be discriminated, even though Africans have never done anything to Malaysia all over history. Then we have one group of people, Europeans, who came to Malaysia and did horrendous things. I mean, we're not only talking about labor slavery. I always say there was a huge aspect of sexual slavery of indigenous women in the colonies. That's always something we never talk about. It was a huge, huge aspect. So for hundreds of years, one group of people have harmed societies all over the world. Yet when that group of people comes, how are they treated? With privilege. So you look like fellow victims and you are discriminated. While when you look like the oppressor, you get them treated with privilege, you know. And I'm not gonna say that I personally didn't feel the advantages of that, you know. I mean, for when I walk around here, I'm a European. It's very simple, but I can sense it. And for me, it's extra bitter because my dad comes from a colonized country, you know. I know what colonization has done to people. And this is for me fascinating. And also it shows the evil of racism. It has gotten so deep into people's minds that they discriminate fellow victims or even themselves, like you just told, and blame their own, like you just told, like, hey, I don't get chances because other people who look like me behave so badly.
Yes.
Instead of the system. And with that comes along, of course, the people who created that system who look like them. That's a weird human characteristic, I would say. What do you feel about that, Dashran?
Yeah, I completely agree, right? And that's the thing. Like, how do we break out of that? It's so difficult because I think around the world, everyone, we try to fit into this whatever success means and all that, and we do whatever to fit in, and on our journey we are of, like you said, reward. Because if you don't, you feel punished, right? So all these psychological things, and you do whatever it takes to fit in, and you completely forget about the realities of it all. So it's either you're suffering in that way, you're part of the oppressed, or you work so hard to be part of the other side, and then you yourself forget, like what your parents might have gone through, and so on and so forth. So it's this weird cycle of how, all it's, you hear it within, like when I have conversations with my friends, now we have different kinds of conversations, because we are trying to break out of it, because and things like that. But when we just talk about widely speaking, most people are so, they argue with each other. Because I think, Karim, you brought up this fantastic example on one of our previous shows as well, where you talked about how, you have noticed in your time teaching here, where an Indian and a Chinese will be arguing with each other and hitting each other, especially, and the Chinese will say, oh, the Indian is like an alcoholic and he's dark skinned and it's ugly and blah blah blah, and so on and so forth, but not realizing that the reason that we even are arguing in the first place is because of colonization, and how they put us in silos, they stoke the flames, they came up with all these racist things, and then they bounced. But because they also control the global media, they have packaged themselves as the heroes of the world, the most beautiful, best looking people, the nicest people, the saviors. Look at the war movies, US is always the heroes,
Right.
even in pop culture, all sorts of things where, and so it just becomes this thing, and the fear is always that if you are like 5 years away from just detached from colonization, it's easy to see, because we have experienced it, the direct impact Whereas as we move further and further away from history, that part is it. So like we have reached a point now where like the wider masses don't talk about colonization, right? Like people just accept that white people are the best and the heroes and the most good looking and so on and so forth. People think that's just the way of life. That's like the fact of life, not realizing that how psychology and years of colonization and oppression have made us think that way.
Yeah, yeah. So you touch on some really good points there, and I would actually disagree on one point. So I agree with
Yes.
you on the global media. I
Yeah.
think that's one of the most insidious ways of keep people indoctrinated with the idea that when you're classified as European white, then you're the heroes in the movies and you're the Western human rights countries and all that blah blah. Even though we know that in reality things are way more nuanced, but with a media system, Hollywood, YouTube, Facebook, you can shape people's minds. I agree. However, there's one point I would like to disagree a bit, and that is the fact that you'd say like, okay, for some people they get born and it's just the reality. You know, you have white people on top, other people at the bottom or in the middle, and they don't question these things. I actually think things are finally changing. So if you would be born, let's say, in the generation of boomers, for example, in those days it was almost normal. And in particular during colonial times, you had very few people questioning it, even though you had them. I mean, I don't know if you ever heard of Frans Fanon. He was a black French academic, if I'm correct, but Black Skin, White Mask. I remember he wrote that book, very good book. And
of the earth as well.
Was that?
The Wretched of the Earth.
Yes, Wretched of the Earth. And so that was in the 20s, I think, 1920s or something. I mean, you always had people who questioned these things very wisely. But in general, people were just like, okay, this is the way the world works. However, now, I mean, I see like mushrooms popping up all over the world, people questioning this, like, hey, how come I am born in Germany, or I am born in the United States or Malaysia and Hong Kong, and I am born and I am treated immediately like somebody who is unworthy than the people from my own country, the same culture? Why? And you see with the younger generation that they seriously start to question also the roots of this hierarchy, which you didn't see before. And that's why you see in so many, also in the academia, so many new young people really start to revive that history, start talking again about colonization. In my country, the Netherlands, it's a huge almost clash between like the indigenous Dutch and the new generation diverse, including white people, saying like, what we just assume that it's all normal, you know, that certain groups of people are in lower jobs, get less chances on the job market, are not represented on television, and they start to questioning this and say like, hey, when are we finally getting the reckoning with our colonial past? And then the Dutch say like, oh, that's the Dutch, the indigenous Dutch would say that, but that's history. We're not gonna talk about history because we've been able to do that for 500 years, ignore the things that we did. But you see now with the new generation, they say, no, we want apology for slavery. We want apology to the Indonesians. We want a museum that discusses the horror of colonization. And it's very interesting. We're now out of colonization, and now it becomes more important because you see a new generation that is out of colonization, but because of the way they look, because of their background, they still get treated like oppressed people in the former colonies. And they're like, what the hell is going on? Why am I discriminated? You know what I mean?
Just to be fair to the people of previous generations, you did have people in all of the colonial system rising up and standing up against the system. But those are the people that were killed, tortured, imprisoned, destroyed. So then what is the lesson you get as someone who's living in that system, who maybe didn't get an education, who didn't get introduced to these kind of revolutionary ideas? The lesson you learn is you better keep your head down and shut up and not think about this, because this is very dangerous. You could end up disappeared, tortured, murdered, etc. So you had that violent hand of the state, preventing this sort of idea from spreading.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah,
even in
definitely.
the US, the Black
Yeah.
Panthers, what happened to them?
Yeah, exactly. And so those things are the reason why it's very difficult, because for the longest time, right? And you're right, Karima. In fact, like how the new generation is changing. I guess sometimes I'm a bit sort of cynical with these things, or less optimistic, is because it still feels that even though a lot more people are speaking up, it's often people in a certain bubble. It's rarely a widespread thing when you talk about, let's say, racial problems, until it affects people's wallets directly. I feel like a lot of times, like
Right.
especially in Malaysia, where it's because, like Peter brought up, where it's like this whole, for years and years we've had this climate of fear. In fact, it's written in our school textbook, since we are in primary school, early secondary school, where we are not supposed to talk about three things in Malaysia. So like this is written in our, it's called the 3 Rs. And it's not written as law. What is written is like as if, like, because these are the three things that will cause a lot of disruption in society and disharmony. So you must never touch it. And the 3 Rs is race, religion, and royalty. Never talk about them. Never speak of them.
Right.
Because the techniques, this is not a British thing. This is I mean, probably they borrowed ideas from the British, but this was when British were already gone. This is our textbooks, now, and how our textbooks have been structured since the 80s. It's because the idea is to avoid conflict and pretend like the issue is not there, so that we can run the country. So the problem with Malaysia, if you want to tie back into politics, Peter, is a lot of it, we have this idea. What Malaysia's strategy is to sort of accept a false sense of peace and stability over, let's go and deal with the conflict, and then we build back up because once you fight and argue and debate and blah blah blah, you have to reach some sort of compromise and understanding. But Malaysia's strategy was to not do that. So what happened after the racial riots in 1969, because we were, the thing about colonization is, technically, because the Brits at that time, when we look at moderns, is they sort of make, even like, let's say, Malaysia and all, they it's not that they are not conservative socially. When we come, let's say, we look at like alcohol rules and whether you are wearing a headscarf, not wearing a headscarf, blah blah blah. So in that sense, Malaysia was more liberal at that time after colonization had gone, until the racial riots in 1969. Even in the 70s, people say we were a fairly more liberal, and you had more intermingling between races and all at that time. But what happened was, there was a conflict, because as things go, there will be conflicts, because at that time we haven't dealt with our post colonialism identity. We haven't had that, and I feel like a lot of countries should have that. So we had that racial riots in 1969, because the opposition party at the time, which was led by Chinese, started to gain a little bit of political prominence, and this unsettled the aristocrats and all sorts of things, and we had a racial riots. But instead of saying, okay, so this conflict happened, why did it happen? How can we learn from this conflict and move on? The government's idea is, let's do everything in our power to make sure a conflict like this never ever happens again, even if it means sacrificing the realities of the situation. So they come up with weird policies, weird affirmative actions. They restructure the education system so you cannot talk about race at all, because they say if you talk about race, it leads to racial conflict. So the idea isn't to embrace it and say we are multi. Yes, race is a construct and all that, but that's not the.
And sorry to interject quickly, but
yes, go ahead,
and of course, if you don't talk about it, you maintain the system as it is.
Exactly.
It's the same. It's the same as the whole colorblind policy in the United States. Race doesn't exist. We're colorblind, and that way you don't need to change it, and it benefits who? Often elites.
Yes. And that reminds me of something that Asal told us when we spoke to her recently. She said she always gets annoyed when she hears the word post-colonial. She's like, what post-colonial? There is no post-colonial. And that made me think of that. It's like, I think what we should talk about is, it's now we're in the neo-colonial era. because the same economic relationships more or less stayed the same, slight changes. But what really matters is real economic political power. That has remained the same. So in this neo-colonial system, by ignoring the disparities and the remnants of the colonial period proper, not the neo-colonial period, but by ignoring the disparities in both periods, then you get to perpetuate the neo-colonial system.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And that also touches on what Dashran said a while ago, and that's that we are still living in a form of colonialism indeed, and also because of that huge, tremendous media power that the West has, to keep the minds and the psychologies of the people subdued in a way that they still believe in that Western white supremacy. I mean, even video games. If I go buy a video game on Steam, I like to play video games. 90% of the times I'm playing with a European-looking white man, sometimes a girl. And if we're lucky, we have one game we have a game where a few black and brown people are sidekicks. You know what I mean? And that maintains that psychological kind of racial hierarchy. And I'm very optimistic to see a change in a generational change in people really starting to understand this. You know what I mean? Which is, in my opinion, a good thing. Why? Because it also means that people can finally join hands to deal with other things, such as climate change, such as livable wages, anything, healthcare. I mean, the only reason we cannot get these things is because the largest part of the population, the working class, they are not joining hands because they're separated into racial groups. It's very simple. It benefits an elite, and it's same in Malaysia probably.
Yeah, it's exactly the same, right? Because we live in a culture that, because of fear, because of capitalism, because of the way things are structured, the narratives and all that, everything is a very keep your heads down, mind your own business, don't get into trouble, work and make money. And the problem with that is people just shut everything out. So they don't understand. It makes you into ignorant people who just, go to work and feed the capitalists. That's essentially what happens. And that's what you see in a lot of other countries where even when we talk about racism, right? Like everyone just talks about racism from a very individual standpoint. Like, this guy bullied me and this guy beat me, whacked me, and which is of course important. The individual side of it is the one you really feel it on a visceral level, but the individual side of it exists because of the systems and because of how they have separated you into your own individual bubbles and your own individual journeys and your own individual things, and you cannot join hands. And if you speak up against the police, you're going to get into trouble, and that will destroy your own individual journey. So don't bother about that. And so when you just continuously live in your bubble, whatever your intent may be, your own personal survival or whatever, and so then it's like you said, you just never join hands with the others. Like the other person's struggles, the other person's suffering means nothing to you. It's like, and you this is your widespread. It's not just a racism thing, right? Like a lot of people will say, like, my dream country is to go to China because it's doing well economically. And if you ask them, like, do you care whether they're oppressing the Muslims there? Do you care whether there's no freedom of speech? Nobody cares. Like, these things are not, of course, people like us care, like people, your students and like my compatriot, like, my friends and peers and colleagues and all that. But like the wider society, I feel because everyone's on their personal journey. So it's difficult to blame people because everyone's like, I need to make money, so I'm just going to go to wherever and do whatever. And like, there's no time for questioning and all that. And it's the same. Like, and that's why if the economy is run fairly well, even if it doesn't benefit the underprivileged, or even if it's not equitable for all, even if it's not equality or whatever, at least if it benefits the middle class fairly balanced to some extent, I think like most people are just like, okay, this is just the way the world is, and let's just continue as usual.
Yeah, I mean, there's a part of psychology that looks at that precisely, like the idea that we're all motivated to a greater or lesser extent to justify whatever system that we live in. And the fundamental motivation there is to avoid a feeling of pain when you recognize that the system that you're living in is unfair, unjust, that people suffer as a result. That recognition is painful. it's much more soothing to just ignore that or to argue against any sort of critique that people present to you about your society, and it ends up allowing you to kind of try to get by as best you can. You focus on your own economic situation, your own chances for advancement, and you don't think so much about systemic critiques, because that just unsettles you and makes you feel bad. It kind of imposes upon you a burden to fight for greater justice. And so it's especially in very competitive, unequal environments, you can see how it's even more attractive to try to just ignore all of that, because you've got to look out for you and your family. So just focus on that, try to ignore the broader systemic issues, and then that ends up playing the role of dividing so that you can be conquered.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, good point. So I've always been very interested, and it's almost a bit confusing of the position of Chinese people in Malaysia. It's a very interesting, complex situation. So on the one hand, you have a lot of political discrimination towards Chinese, and Chinese, I know for a fact that many Chinese actually feel persecuted in Malaysia in some way, shape, or form. Yeah. And on the other hand, you would also say, and you see it in Singapore even more strongly, but you do see it, I feel, also in Malaysia, a kind of Chinese privilege. That is, that the Chinese often live in well-off gated communities. And I think also what plays a huge role is that Chinese, and a lot of people don't speak about it, but the Chinese females seem to occupy a kind of beauty symbol in East Asian and Southeast Asian countries, more so even lately than what you would see with Western women, even though the Chinese themselves, like here in Hong Kong, still look up to Western women due to that colonial indoctrination. But this is always been very fascinating aspect to me about Malaysia and other East Asian countries, is how on the one hand Chinese are discriminated, but not as like in the West. In the West, for example, Australia, Chinese are discriminated like Indians are discriminated. They're the same stereotypes, they're smelly, they're this, they're that. But when you come in Malaysia, you see that it's almost like these, sometimes you become trophy women, Chinese girls, like they're considered the beauty symbol, they're attractive, they're light-skinned, they often are so-called class. And then you see that dynamic also among Chinese. That is, you see severe racism often among Chinese females. I've noticed that. I know a lot of Chinese people in my life and also females in my life. And I think it's one of the few groups where I saw more severe racism among the females than actually among the males. And recent psychological studies actually prove my point. Very interesting study has been done in Singapore and in Hong Kong. And I don't know, maybe you can talk a bit more about that as a Malaysian. Have you noticed stuff like that?
It's very, very interesting, because again, like with Malaysia, I feel it's the complexities are very fascinating and sometimes troubling as well. And I feel the reason why, number one, I will agree that on all fronts there, because Chinese are the most severely persecuted politically. They are used as the biggest scapegoats by the right wing to garner support. They are used as the biggest scapegoats, or these guys are here to steal your jobs and they are here to make the country more Chinese and all sorts of rubbish. So they feel a brunt of it. But at the same time, it's very interesting, because how then do they become at the same time the sort of symbol of beauty and all sorts of things? And I think that ties back strongly into the economic side of things, because they have the biggest purchasing power in the country. And I feel they get to, in a way, directly or indirectly, not that the Chinese people are purposely doing something to hurt other races, but I think because you have the biggest purchasing power, then all the ads and all the way the media is structured, everything comes in your favor. And also because you have the economic privilege, so maybe you have a lot more Chinese in like sort of developed states like Kuala Lumpur and Selangor. And so once you have a lot more of that, where people in these kind of places are the ones that, like I said, like even if you just look at it from a very superficial level, right? Places in Los Angeles, for example, is where, oh, you become like the fashion icons, and people think, oh, you are the prettiest people in the country are there, and you dress differently, less conservatively from people in other states. You have less, and also I think all these different aspects sort of shape the reason why, like, Chinese people, for example, are seen, like Chinese women, for example, are seen as stereotypically seen as like the most beautiful, for example, or like the most desirable, because they are like, compared to women from other races in Malaysia, for example, they are more perhaps more liberal in that sense, right? In the way they dress, in the way they express, and all sorts of things. And I think it's because of structures that are in place on top of the work that they had to put in amid the political difficulties and whatnot, that and their purchasing power, I think, economically speaking, sort of shapes the narrative, I think. What do you all
Yeah,
think?
so I agree with you. That
Yeah.
really taps into the same as what you see with Western media, global media domination. But I do also think that the Chinese have the luck in this sense that they in a post-colonial world, they are the females are in that sense blessed with the possibility to maintain very light skin, and you see that in Asia that is still so internalized that even among Malays who would very much discriminate Chinese in some cases, not all, of course, also admire a lot of these Chinese ladies for their light skin, for example. When we talk about ads, but in particular, what strikes me also, if you live in Malaysia, and I've lived there for 3 years, if you live there and you would just see Malaysians in booklets and on billboards, you would think that Malaysians are as white as Arabs, You would really think that they almost look like Arabs, because of all the billboards, you see these headscarves with very light-skinned women underneath it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, it's almost like a whitewashing of the self you see in countries like Malaysia, that it creates a kind of, I would always say, it creates a kind of self-delusion. Why does it create a kind of self-delusion? Because you see the same thing in Hong Kong. When you put on the television, you only see pale-skinned Chinese, okay? Whether it's sitcoms, commercials, the news, to such an extent that Chinese start to forget that there are also brown Chinese. And I had a friend of mine, she's 100% Hong Kong Chinese. And she told me she gets so sick of it, always that wherever she goes, she gets asked if she's from Thailand by her fellow Chinese. And she's like, no, I'm Chinese. And it's because you get so inundated by media that is the way your group looks, that you start to forget what your group really looks like. And I think there's something like that going on in Malaysia too.
I think so, and but also, right, I think another thing, and this part maybe I won't give credit to the British, our dear old British people. I think because in Asian cultures, even before British, definitely, I mean, like the whites, European whites definitely created perhaps racism as we know it, in terms of racial hierarchy. You come from different places, you look different, so we put you in these categories. But I think within Asian culture, even outside of colonialism, so like colorism and things like that is a very real thing, where if you look at, like, even historically, in ancient India, the upper caste people are somehow fair skinned, and like the lower caste people, as you go darker and darker, you're on the lower and the on the lower caste, and I think although Chinese people, they don't have a caste system, it's the same, because you hear it in day-to-day conversations. It's not so much, even when you look at people, let's say if you go to an Indian family who will never let you marry any other race, even including white people. No, you can only marry an Indian. But still, when their kid is born, they are always hoping for the kid to be fair. And like they will say, like, no, like I hope, like you hear it at like weddings, where like aunties and uncles are trying to do like arranged marriages and set their kids up or whatever, they will say things like, oh, I know this girl and she's really fair, and like that. They will purposely stress like, really fair, or like all their siblings are fair as well, and things like that. It goes both ways, right, guys and girls. But I think girls feel in this aspect, definitely women feel it more. I think guys get away with being dark skin beauty standard wise more than women. They really feel the brunt of it. But you hear that, and this is outside of, I think, just Western media influence. I think there is something there within the Asian culture as well, where we need to look internally and see why. Because you hear this, like you said, Karim, even within like the Chinese community. Growing up in primary school, I would see like my Chinese friend who maybe not like, now when we are more aware and more, we know things and all, like now when you look back at his picture, he's like perhaps the most good looking guy, like objectively among like everyone. He's just darker, but growing up, like they would treat him as if like he's the ugliest person like of all, because he's darker. Like the Chinese community, within the Chinese community, they'll make fun of him, like, oh, why you so dark, like how did you become like this, or did you like spend your entire, when you were in did your parents like dry you out like a dry fish when you were a baby, like all these kinds of jokes and things like that. And
that's,
I think, I think it's something that Asians, we need to take a hard look at ourselves, outside of colonialism as well.
and still these things can change, and these things can change very rapidly. Why am I saying this? Because don't forget that in the Renaissance Europe, colorism was there. It was there. Colorism was in Renaissance Europe. If you were a little bit obese and very light skinned, you were very attractive. While now you need to be slim and tanned. And why? Because now being slim and fit and tan is a showing of class, because you have leisure time. You know what I mean? So that changed. So you always see that beauty. What you just said, also Dashran, beauty is always related to wealth. And I think once the elite, political, or I should say the wealth class starts to change in their looks, I mean, they can be as dark as you can imagine, and it becomes the new standard. It is that subjective, human taste. Human taste is not in the eye of the beholder, it's in culture, and often tied to wealth. You know what I mean? And like I said, I've discussed it with you before, Dashran, in one of your shows, is that during the reign of the Arab world, between 700 and 1400, the most beautiful women were considered women from Eastern Ethiopia. We would now classify these women as black, as one of the most black people in the world. They were considered the most attractive females back in the day. Okay, and don't forget, these Arab wealthy men had concubines from all over the world, Chinese, European, doesn't matter. But Eastern Ethiopian females were the standard of absolute beauty. Something that right now we would almost confuse us, like how is this possible? But it's the same with obesity. If we would show the thin women we have now to people from Renaissance Europe, they would say, "What are you doing? They look like poor people." They would say this is disgusting. You know what I mean? But now when you see obese people, a lot of people would say like, "You think that is attractive?" So you see how that changes due to the time spirit.
Yes.
While for us, it seems like almost just with colonialism, you get born in it, so you think it's a fact. Just like with racial hierarchies.
Yeah. Even in Karim, you wrote a paper on this, and you brought up how there's a long history of this class connection with skin. You don't have to work out in the fields, so you can stay inside all day, and so you end up having a lighter skin tone, and so that becomes a status symbol. Just as a idle piece of speculation, I wonder, I remember reading, and these genetic studies change so often because new evidence comes in and technology is always improving. But at least as of a few years ago, the kind of consensus position was that light skin was an evolutionary adaptation that's less than 10,000 years old, so extremely recent. So I could imagine there could be a kind of like a novelty thing there, where humans are like, "Oh, that's new. That's interesting. That's attractive." Like red hair. Like that's an interesting variation. I like that. And then you can have like something as small and irrelevant as that, but then when you combine it with our kind of deep-seated desire to have a mate who can provide for our children, whether they be male or female. I was just learning like the 3 top words that you would use in Chinese to describe an attractive mate, and for both men and women, fu or having wealth is part of it. And then for women, bai, having light skin is also one of the key terms. For men, it's being tall. But you can see how like
for men it's being tall.
Yeah, for men it's being tall.
Man, that heightism is already thousands of years old. I'm lucky in that sense, man. I'm 6'4".
Same here.
yeah, good stuff.
You've got height.
How tall are you, Dashran? How tall are you?
180, so I think almost 6. You are 6'4". That's different, bro.
195.
Like, yes, you need to be 195 to be considered tall. You know, as a European, I don't need to be 195. Where I'm from, 180 cuts it.
Yeah, but it's normal in the Netherlands. Don't get me wrong. In the Netherlands, I'm nothing special.
Yeah, but it's interesting how all of these little factors can play a role. But then I think the major one is status. It's how safe are you? How many resources is society going to give you versus someone that you know that they're going to be excluded from social resources. They're going to be kept in menial positions. You know, that kind of status, our sensitivity to status, I think, can very easily attach to all sorts of different characteristics, not just skin color, but height, body type, religion, language, all of these things. We're overly sensitive to these markers, and I think in terms of making changes in how prejudice operates, one of the most low-hanging fruit is eliminating massive wealth gaps, eliminating massive power gaps between groups.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do not understand how much the economic side of it actually contributes to a lot of these issues. And that's why, like, as I was talking to you about the left wing, right wing thing, Peter, it's like you said, both sides are not actually making any significant changes. Like if you talk about US context, because they're not redistributing the wealth in any sort of way. So even when you talk about social issues and whatnot, you only can make very small changes, which then you're going to argue for the next 20 years and sort of things. Whereas it's not actually making these sweeping changes, because if you want to see how how the beauty standards change, whether people are pro-choice, pro-life, if you actually change the economic thing, if let's say women are across the board, they are empowered to economically, or like minorities, different skin colors are empowered economically, that's when I think we will also see that without even making too much noise, we will automatically see more representation in films, more, all these sorts of things. Because the reality is, like, even when we talk about representation in films, right, we celebrate, for example, a film like Black Panther, and we should celebrate, right? It's a huge milestone and all that. But the people at Disney, they are not sitting there and being like, okay, we need to do for good for the African American community, so let's make this film. They are like, okay, now that we've, in this 2020, this modern Gen Y, Gen Z era, like, if you make a movie about like Black people, you're gonna make a lot of money from it. And that's their motivation, right? And that's the same reason why a lot of major brands, global brands like sporting goods, Adidas, whatever, so on and so forth. Few years ago, when there was a call for Black Lives Matter and whatnot, everyone stayed away from it because they were like, I think if I say I support this, I'm going to lose income. But suddenly in 2020, everyone was like pro Black Lives Matter because they realized if they don't say it, they're going to lose income. So for all these people, it's just about whether it's going to affect their bottom line. And so if you actually redistribute the wealth and empower all, like, like sectors of society, like everyone has equity and all that, you will, I think automatically the social issues will, not to say get resolved, I think they will be less of an issue in general. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Just imagine if the African continent had been able to keep all of its wealth that it produced, and it hadn't been just stolen by Europe for the past 500 years. Imagine if that had been the case, and Africa to be one of the wealthiest continents today. What would Hollywood movies be like? There would be all sorts of African main characters because they would want to
Yep.
sell tickets all throughout the African continent.
Right.
And with the example you just gave is perfect. Like, imagine if the Black Lives Matter movement were instead like the Black Panther movement reborn, arguing for economic equality and socialism, literally what they were arguing for. That would not be picked up by the kind of
Yeah.
corporate mainstream. But you know, these other movements that don't touch on economic power, as long as they stay away from that, then they can be co-opted. But as soon as they delve into, we're going to actually have to shift power, real power, that's where you get serious and at times deadly violence being directed against.
Right. So the moment you start to touch the fundamentals of the capitalist class, then they don't want to support anti-racism anymore. Then it's over. But I think you say something very interesting, Dashran, and that touches on what I always call representational mobility. And that is the fact that people from the global south, the darker skinned people, so to speak, don't have that economic power, right, to represent themselves in movies, news, videos, whatever. And at the same time, because they don't have that power, they are represented in economically lower status positions, whether as a country or as jobs within countries like Malaysia. So it goes two ways, that it internalizes in people like, okay, these are less worthy people because you never see them represented, they don't have the means, and always see them overrepresented in lower status positions. You know what I mean? It's pure psychology that's going on with these hierarchies.
Yeah, it's like self-reinforcing.
Yeah, and like even when we make, when the like there's this false idea of peace also, right? Because whenever I show, let's say, certain friends, let's say some friends, a movie like Malcolm X, or even like let's say like Tamil movie about lower class people, and they are engaging in violence because they have been pushed to the point where there is no other options left. Like, it disturbs people because they are like, no, but why are these people engaging in violence? Because they're looking at it in a silos. You know, they don't realize. So people, I feel like a lot of people, they like, although there's loads of, it's like what both of y'all brought up, right? This thing where they don't want that dissonance in the, you know, that cognitive dissonance where like, oh, okay, so there's something actually going on. And whereas it's easier to just, you know, accept things. It's not just about race, right? I think we see this like across any issues. Like even if we say like, for example, decriminalization of drugs for personal use because people are unfairly incarcerated, and so on and so forth. Even there's if you tell like a normal person, they're like, no, how can you? These are the worst of society. They deserve to go in jail. You know, if you do, you know, you have to go in jail. But people don't realize that even that is actually, a lot of it is like economically motivated, it's politically motivated, you know, all these sorts of decisions. But people just accept it as this is the way of life, you know, like, of course, let's say in Malaysian context, if you dabble in, like, say, marijuana, of course you deserve to go to jail because only the scum of the earth will dabble in those sorts of things, you know. But people don't realize that why are those laws in place in the first place? How does that also tie to colonialism, or what, you know, the white powers of that time were trying to accomplish at that? Why is it that also when it comes to certain laws like that, only certain subsection of societies get impacted really badly? You know, like, I don't think people really think about these things too often, because then it makes them feel like there's this burden. So then I want to ask you guys like this philosophical sort of question. Who do you think are the sheep then, you know, in these situations? Are we the you know, are they the sheep? I'm just using it, not everyone, but, you know, the people who are asleep. Or are we, because I mean, yeah, we know, like, let's say we discuss all these things, but we seem to be the ones that are troubled the most. We have the most like sleepless nights, like, so to speak, right? Because
Yeah.
it feels like we are screaming and nobody's listening sometimes. Whereas like the rest of the people, they are like, they take the blue pill in the matrix and they are happy, with their fake, whatever it may be, the simulation, let's call it that, if you just want to be dramatic about it, whereas, we take the red pill and everything is brown and bleak and dusty.
Yeah, it seems to be. It seems to be that some people who don't think about these things seem to sometimes be happier in their lives than those who struggle against it. But I wonder if that's the case. I wonder if people who don't think about these things are actually living a better or happy life. For example, when they work hard in the plantations because they cannot get further in life, or when they're born in Africa doing fishing in waters that are polluted with Western corporation oil, that they just because they don't think about it, that their life is better. I don't think so. I think some people, it may be a defense mechanism, some people may not realize it, but I feel that once you know, that's the problem. Once you know, you cannot go back because you have the moral obligation to do something about it, even though they may not be aware of it. I'm 100% sure there were a lot of enslaved people back in the day who just thought it's just normal. Does it mean that, okay, their life is better because they don't think about it? No. I and a lot of people back in the day, once you know this is wrong, even though it may like stir up a lot of troubles, also, hey, a lot of sleepless nights, there is this kind of weird thing we have as human beings, and that's a moral compass. Moral compass may be considered highly subjective, but it's a moral compass. It comes from somewhere. And once you know this, you can morally just not let go. I think that's the biggest problem. And let's be honest, if you look at the greatest names from history, who were those? The ones who sided with power, or are the greatest names from history always the ones who challenged power? In my opinion, I think it's the ones who challenged power because they saw things going on. Whether we talk about Frans Fanon that we just talked about, or Malcolm X, or Nelson Mandela, I had to stay in the realm of racism. I think these are the people we remember. You know what I mean? And they are the ones who started the change. Who started the wheel of change. What do you think, Peter?
Mandela is a great example of that because he kind of embodies both tendencies. Like before he gained power in South Africa, like I think that's what he's really remembered for. It's that his work in the ANC during apartheid. Afterwards, when the ANC kind of became a kind of caretaker of the same neocolonial neoliberal system and kind of betrayed its original founding principles, nobody remembers him for that, or nobody thinks highly of him for that. People think highly of him when he was a rebel, when he was considered a terrorist, literally, by the U.S. government. The ANC was still considered a terrorist organization in the United States until 2008, officially. They just forgot to take them off the terrorist group list. I think that provides a good example of what you were saying.
Yeah, and it says something about the whole subjective title of terrorist, eh?
For sure.
But to your point, Dashran, I was thinking for years now, like the saying that knowledge is power. I'm really dubious about that. I think sometimes knowledge is impotence, or at least it's knowledge of your own impotence, because you need to get ideas into so many people's heads, and if you don't have the ability to do that, it's just revealing how powerless you are.
Yes, I think
that's the privilege we have, of course, as educators, Peter, and you as a radio show, somebody who has a radio show, is that we have the power to plant some seeds, and I always say to my students, just one seed planted in one mind is a mind that talks for the rest of his or her life to other minds. So it's hugely exponential. You know what I mean? So I think
Yeah.
we do have a way to convince people, you know.
Yeah.
That's what just now, what was it? 4 days ago, we talked to Asal. She made that point about post-colonial, that word.
Mhm.
And now, just because she planted that seed in my head, every time I hear that, I'm going to think, no,
Yes.
no, no, it's
No, it's
neo-colonial.
yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah.
Like, I mean,
She
yeah.
also pointed out how absurd it is to talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's like, no, they're all Abrahamic religions. It would be the Judeo-Christo-Islamic tradition. You know, it doesn't make sense to kind of cut it off at one point. And that's one of those ideas that she just planted in my head, and now I can't get it out. And every time somebody says Judeo-Christian, I it's an automatic reflex to bring up her point. So yeah, there is.
But you know, like even the whole term Judeo-Christian is, of course, ridiculous because Jews and Christians were bashing each other's heads in for ages because they didn't connect. You know,
especially the Christians bashing the Jewish heads, but yeah.
right, and that true, and then we got the whole issue in the West with Islam, and suddenly Judeo-Christian was something that was pitted against Islam, and I bet you give it another 100 years and you have Judeo-Christian Islamic cultures. You know what I mean? It's so flexible.
Yeah.
So, but before we wander
Yes.
off too much, there was one more thing I wanted to ask you,
Yes.
and that is, like when we think about racism and colonialism, all these things, like when you look at Malaysia right now, what do you feel is being done about it? Is it a popular thing? Is it becoming more popular? Do you see it growing in the new generation? Are things happening in education or media? What is your feeling?
Honestly, I think this is the perfect question that perhaps my answer would have been completely different if you asked me 2 years ago. Because what I feel is happening now, a lot of it ties back to economy, but I think it's also socially, we are going to see a massive awakening. And this is like a lot of, when I speak to a lot of political analysts and all, because a lot of things, so like we've talked about so many times, as we know, just to recap before I get into this one, we know that the Malays have the political dominance in the country, the political privilege. The Chinese have had the economical privilege. If you want to just look at it that way, like top 10 richest people in the country and so on and so forth. And because of that, large subsection have been the Malays, the large section of the poor people have been the Malays and all. It's been very easy for these political elites to manipulate and spread false propaganda and so, all sorts of things, right? And still manage to get votes and keep themselves in power. But what we are noticing now, especially over the past few weeks, particularly this year, is because of right now we have a very many would call a right-wing government, and it is. It's really it is really a right-wing government. Even they don't pretend to be champions of Malays and Islam. That's their sort of branding. That's their sort of supremacy and so on and so forth. That's how they brand themselves, right? And what we are seeing now is they have handled the COVID-19 crisis so badly that before this, although for example, if you just look at it from just look at the poor communities and see that, for example, if you take the Malay community, although they were poor, the why they are poor, why they have lack of access to education or why they have lack of access to job opportunities, this may be a bit too high concept, for uneducated people, regardless. I mean, people who don't have, they don't study the economy, or they don't, they haven't gone to school. If you're like fishermen and all these things, you're looking at it from a daily wage standpoint. This is cuts across all races, regardless of where you are in the world, right? Like you need to be a little bit more educated to understand like economy and all that. Even like smart people, so-called smart people like me, struggle to understand like economy and all sometimes, right? So, but what's happening now is because of how poorly the COVID-19 situation is managed, who ends up suffering the most when there's a time of crisis, health crisis and all? The poor people. And this is something that anyone can understand because your family is dying.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. There is no,
Right.
oh, because if you run the economy this way, then in 10 years, your children will have better access to education. And there's no such thing. This is as simple as I had a job yesterday and now I don't. And I don't have a job and there's no aid. So this so-called government who has been championing all this, like, oh yeah, we will take care of your rights, we will take care of your positions in the country, they are slowly starting to show, not slowly, rapidly starting to show major cracks, that the poor people, a large percentage of them who are the Malays, now they know for a fact already that this government who has been saying all these things, well, if they really meant any of it, I wouldn't be losing my jobs.
Right.
I wouldn't be committing suicide. In Malaysia now, we have on average in 2021, 4 suicide cases a day because of the mismanagement of the COVID-19 crisis on various levels, you know, and so this has, like, because of this, many have sort of started to like analysts and academics and people who study politics and all, they say that this could be the awakening that many people have been really waiting for or hoping for, because the majority population might actually turn on the government who is so-called championing their rights, because they realize that the government hasn't actually been doing that. So
And you feel, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
So
and so yeah.
Sorry.
Question, Karim. Just shoot.
Oh, no, so
shoot your
I was
question,
like,
and I'll go from there. Yeah.
So you feel that would make that would create a bridge between people, like, of different racial groups?
I think so, because like Malaysian politics, when it comes to race and religion, it's very, very, you don't even need to look at it from a very, like a racial narrative standpoint or whatever. If you just look at the way, for example, the Malaysian Electoral College or our constituencies, the way gerrymandering has occurred throughout the years, you see similar patterns to the US, where it is drawn, the lines are very weirdly and unfairly drawn over the years, where if you look at every single constituency, there is some sort of racial disproportion there, where like this constituency suddenly is like 90% Malays, and that constituency has like very little Malays, and things like that. So everything is done in a way to keep the elites in power, like regardless of which party, right? For many, many years, this is what's been done. And so that's why it's very difficult to bridge a gap or like to get a sort of unity, like among races, to push for social cause, like for social change or anything, economic change or anything like that, because it's very easy to see like, it's very easy to be like, oh, those people, the areas where there's so many Chinese, for example, or those are the areas that, voted for the non-supremacy government, for example, or a more fair government, or for a Malaysia for all government sort of thing. Instead of a Malay government, we say it's a Malaysian government. And they say like, oh, it's because like, the Chinese turned on you or the Indians turned on you, for example. But in reality, when you look at the numbers, a lot of Malays may have voted for the progressive government as well. But because you look at it, the way the lines are drawn, it's like the US, right? You see like, oh, like, yeah, like the whites are all supporting Donald Trump, for example, that sort of thing. But it's because the way, you have the way, like the imbalances in the constituencies and the electoral college. And also you will see like, one, like they call it the red states and the blue states. Although when you switch the states into like people, when like there's this diff and this sort of graph that people made after the 2020 US elections, where instead of drawing it as states, if you change it to people in terms of population, where people are this one, and you change it to red people and blue people, you will realize that it's actually people are much more integrated. But when you just draw it as states and constituencies, it feels that, oh, the non-Malays are all ganging up on one side and the Malays are all ganging up on the other side, but actually that's not the case. So it's very complex in that sense. But I think because the majority race, let's say, like a lot of them, the people like in the swing states or in the so-called, let's say, people in the Texas of Malaysia, just to give it like sort of parallels, if let's say people in Texas, if let's say the COVID situation was handled so badly that they are the biggest amount of that's to such an uncontrollable degree, because in the US, it's still like Biden came and like they managed vaccine, like loads of problems in the US, just focusing on vaccine rollouts. They've done a good job for them, in relatively good job once like Biden came in. So, but imagine if people in Texas were the highest number of suicide rates because of the pandemic. Imagine people in Texas are the one who are dying the most because of Donald Trump, to such an exponential degree. The people in Texas who are the ones suffering the most, losing their jobs on a daily basis to such an exponential degree, then we will be like, okay, maybe now Texas is going to vote for Democrats.
Well, that's
Right.
what.
So you would say that the Muslim Malays are actually disproportionately suffering right now, even though their
Yes.
party is in power.
Yes, 100%. That's what we are
where
seeing.
political organization becomes so important, and spreading information becomes so important, because if I were a member of that dominant party, I would see this as a problem, but also an opportunity. Because if I could spread a explanation of the situation as the result of whatever outgroup that I want to use to scapegoat, and take the blame off of my party, then you're going to have fertile soil for any sort of explanation that is at least somewhat plausible, that gives people an understanding of why they're suffering. So for people that want a different kind of government, a different kind of political economy, it presents a great opportunity, but they have to get their explanation of what the problem is, who caused it, and also what the solution is. Otherwise, you can get all sorts of demagogues saying, oh, it's the Indians, it's the Chinese, it's the communists, whatever. That they're the real problem. So you need to double down on your support for us. And I think of that when you brought up the Texas example, because even just having an objective reality of you are suffering more than other groups because your Republican governor or a state senator or whatever, your president, messed up massively. That's one interpretation of reality. I would think it's the correct one, but it might not be the one that actually spreads. If it's not the one that's on the radio stations, if it's not the one on TV, if it's not the one in the newspapers or magazines people read, or the internet websites they go to, they can very easily fasten upon an explanation that says, oh, this was spread by all those Mexican immigrants or the Honduran immigrants. And then they can just double down on the same sort of political strategies that caused their suffering in the first place. And then you get an even worse situation. But it does present an opportunity. I think, I can't disagree with you on that.
You're absolutely right on that. And that's the fear as well, right? Because now, as you mentioned, the government has amped up their anti-refugee propaganda, their anti-immigrant propaganda, as well as their anti-LGBT propaganda. So they are using all sorts of distractions, as you just brought up, Peter, because, okay, we cannot solve COVID, so now let's bring up social issues, racial issues, and like amp it up to 11 and like try and blame other people. Because I remember there were even like when COVID, before people started to understand COVID more and more as they do now. I remember like last year when COVID first came to Malaysian shores, there were a lot of these propaganda things flying around about the reason COVID is affecting certain parts of Malaysia is because of the LGBT community, and it's like the universe punishing us for the sins of the LGBT community, and so on and so forth. So you see these kinds of things. Of course, now you cannot say those things anymore because like COVID is such a, everyone knows, you still have anti-vaxxers and whatnot, but for the most part, people know that COVID is not caused by LGBT community. Like, I think you can be a complete idiot to know that, that's not the reality, but they do. So like, they always try to distract, and they always try to come up with various things. So of course we cannot be too confident, because I think there's always this incumbent privilege or the incumbent benefit or advantage, not privilege. I think advantage is the better word, where they get to dictate more than the people on the other side, because they have now the machinery, the power, and the money and all that. So we cannot be too overconfident. But let's just say, like, I'm not going to repeat what was said, but let's just say in my entire life, if I go on social media, I've never seen this amount of abusive language and dissent hurled towards the elite politicians of the country by the majority race of the country in my entire life. I've never seen that as I've seen in the past 1 month. So that is certainly one positive indicator, I would say.
And do you also see a more of a reach out across ethnic / racial lines? Like, do you see a kind of organization going on?
Yeah, you see, that's the problem, because the problem in Malaysia is because right now the government is terribly right wing, but the opposition is very weak. So in terms of organization and mobilization, it's very weak. And so a lot of this dissent is happening in large numbers, but it's not happening together with a single goal, with a single sort of channel, like let's come together and work. So that's a big problem that a lot of journalists and political analysts have critiqued the opposition side. So that they need to get their act together as well. But you are seeing a little bit more of awareness, I would say, that transcends racial and religious lines, because I am, again, going back to what I said first time in my entire life sort of thing, I'm starting to see more people in, let's say, a slightly more conservative media. They are right-wing media, but not the level of Fox News is, but they lean, let's say, right wing. And so I always like to go to the comment section of these medias, because, instead, if I'm always just in the BFM comment section, you don't get a perspective of the wider population, right? So I like to go on the comment section, and the comment section in these medias, I'm also seeing abusive language towards the political elite. And so to me, it's sort of like going on Fox, maybe not that extreme, but going to the Fox channel's comment section and seeing everyone crapping on Trump, which is unusual. Very, very unusual. And so that is what we are starting to see. And so that gives us a lot of, gives progressives a lot of hope right now in this past few months. But as far as whether we are coming together and mobilizing and organizing, not yet.
Well, that's at least some green shoots there.
Yeah, certainly. It's quite surprising, actually, pleasantly surprising. Yeah.
I'm unaccustomed to this feeling of hopefulness.
Same here, man. Same here.
So I guess we can wrap it up. We've taken a lot of your time already.
It's nice to wrap up on a hopeful note.
Yes.
Well, yeah.
Yes, we try.
Your show, Dashran, at BFM Radio, seems to be a very good platform to educate the newer generation Malaysians about the remnants of colonialism and colonial racism. I was just wondering, as an end, like, how to what extent do you think your platform is a good way of reaching Malaysians and trying to change their hearts and minds?
That's I think it's a very interesting question, because I feel like it's a bit of a sort of conflict I wrestle with sometimes, because on the one end, I genuinely believe that we are pushing boundaries. We are really we have all these, we do discuss all these kinds of things and interesting topics, important topics, sensitive topics that most mainstream media and all don't really explain. They are not, we actually bring people on and talk about 45 minutes about feminism and patriarchy and colorism and on all sorts of things, right? So on that sense, we're definitely pushing for change. And like you said, that, infecting one mind can make a big difference. But of course, there's always the fear when we do these kinds of things, is whether are we just preaching to the choir? Like, for example, like if you're someone if you're a Vox, like you write for Vox, for example, is the Vox people, if you know that they are changing the minds or improving and pushing for change among, let's say, people on the left or maybe center right towards the left. But I guess the biggest conflict or the biggest thing that we always wrestle with, or that I always wrestle with, is, am I reaching out to the Trump supporters, quote unquote, in that sense? Like, or am I, and if I'm not reaching out to the Trump supporters, or whatever that means in Malaysian context, am I then preaching to the choir? So I guess that's a bit of conflict. But for the most part, I think, we do what we can, even however small it may be. And I think it makes hopefully makes some sort of difference.
Well, then I can give you a positive
Yes.
feedback, because I remember being on your show and talking about colonialism and the effects on Malaysian society, also other societies that are under.
Yes.
And I actually received emails after being on your show from Malaysians thanking me and saying that they've never thought about it that way, and it opened their eyes. And it happened multiple times actually after being on Dashran's show, Peter, that I received emails from Malaysians. And I've actually also been invited at home to have dinner and that kind of stuff. Very, very funny. So
That's
you do have an
fantastic.
effect on people who never saw the
Yeah.
things these ways. So
That's fantastic. That's great to hear. Yeah, I'm always happy to have you guys on the show.
yeah. Our pleasure. Yeah, great.
absolutely.
So anything else you want to say, Peter? Or
Well, if we were no longer recording, I would just go into.
well, yes, I'm still recording. Still the show, man. We're still at the show.
Then we will wrap this stuff up, and then we'll have our more
Yeah, no, in that case, no, it's okay.
unfiltered conversation.
So Dashran, just to wrap it up, where can
Yes.
people find you?
Okay, you can follow me on social media. I'm mostly active on Twitter, so you can head over there. Dashran Yohan. It's just an extension of my work. So basically, whatever I say on air, I talk about on Twitter as well. So you can just follow me there. But yeah, I think more importantly, check out bfm.my. We have not just my shows. I'm just one guy in like a really, really cool company. Like I'm like not saying that because I work there, but like legit, I think we do really good stories. We try to push the boundaries on a daily basis.
I agree.
So
I agree.
just head over
Great
to
station.
bfm.my. Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you.
no, great
so you can
station.
check out like loads of good stuff. So yeah.
Also,
check us
what's
out
your
there.
Twitter handle?
My name, so just Dashran Yohan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, at Dashran Yohan. Yeah.
Yeah, you guys are using social media. I'm not. I hate it. I think it's another form of indoctrination. So I quit all my social media.
Yeah, I remember asking you once because I wanted to tag you in the show that I did, and then Karim was like, "No, like I'm not going to be part of that. I'm not going to be a slave to this system."
Yeah. Peter also asked me. He often asked me to come back to help him in debates, and then I say, these political debates is the exact reason why I left, man. I'm not gonna come back for that stuff, seriously. Oh my god. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so
All right, guys.
so that was a very, very great show, and thanks for coming on, Dashran, and probably we will
Thanks.
we will probably soon meet again.
Yes,
And,
thanks for having me. Happy to chat with you all, guys, anytime.
Okay, great, cool, and
Yeah.
have a good day, everyone.
Yes.